Hi, my name is Karla Noyes. My presentation today is a brief look at the early career of Thomas Oliver Larkin. First, let me say that there are 29 volumes of his manuscripts taking up 7 linear feet in the Bancroft Library. I'm presenting just a thin sliver about the man. Larkin is generally known for being the first American consul to Mexican California. I wanted to learn why he received this honor. He was born September 16, 1802, in Charleston, Massachusetts, just across the Charles River from Boston. He had deep Yankee roots. He had a relative on the Mayflower. One fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Another owned Paul Revere's horse. He had a large extended family. His mother, Anne Rogers, married 3 times. Her first husband had 8 children. Her third husband had 10. The only child of Anne's with her first husband was John B.R. Cooper of the Cooper-Malera complex in Monterey. Anne's second marriage produced our Thomas. Anne's third husband, Amora Childs, was a successful banker who was frugal and keenly interested in making money. In 1843, Larkin's stepbrother Ebenezer Childs wrote, "Father looks old, but is hearty and vigorous, still intent on the acquisition of money." Larkin shared this passion for wealth. In 1819, at 15 years old, Thomas was sent across the river to Boston to learn the art of making books. While he was there, his mother died. He wrote, "So there went the last of my peace and innocence." Larkin refused to submit to training because he was stubborn. He tried selling books and didn't like that either, but he learned about supply and demand. While he had little formal education, he was a prolific reader and writer. In 1821, at 19 years old, he left Boston with a friend to seek our fortune and rise or fall with one another. They traveled to Wilmington, North Carolina. Within 2 weeks, Larkin found employment as a clerk. The following year, he sailed to Bermuda as a cargo manager. The captain was frequently drunk, and Larkin didn't get paid, but he gained experience of shipping and trade at 20 years old. He returned to Wilmington, and he and his friend opened a small store. In about 2 years, they dissolved the partnership with, as Larkin writes, no profit, but considerable experience to go upon in the future. Larkin went to New York for a vacation, but before he left, he became seriously ill for a week, possibly with yellow fever. He thought he was going to die. When he got back to Boston, he was alarmed that his relatives and friends didn't recognize him. "In the streets, I passed and jostled my very relations without their recognizing me. Strange that these few years could have altered me so much, but it had." He returned to Wilmington in 1824 with his 16-year-old brother. This time, Larkin brought goods, purchased on credit, that he knew would sell. Apparently, the dissolution of the previous partnership was not amicable, because his friend tried to destroy Larkin's reputation among his creditors and family in Boston. He said that Larkin was always at the theater, frequented a gambling house 7 nights a week, with the implication of even worse depravity. And Larkin's family believed him. Larkin writes, "This man interfering in my affairs was the cause of perpetual grief to me for months." In 1825, he overcame the rumors and opened another store in Rockfish, North Carolina. The new store did well, and he bought a small plantation. That same year, he was appointed Justice of the Peace to settle disputes between neighbors. He was 21 years old. He writes, "Let me, by constant industry and perseverance, persist in a certain line of conduct that shall lead on to those enjoyments that I now pant for, to gain wealth." That same year, he opened a post office in his store. Later, he sold the store and purchased a sawmill on credit. The sawmill went bust and left him in debt. He lost everything. In a letter to his stepbrother Ebenezer Childs in 1831, Larkin writes, "I do believe our family thinks but little of us, and thinks we shall never be much." In this letter, he outlines 3 possible futures. He could marry a wealthy cousin, if he liked her, and with her money pay off his debts. He could see if his stepbrother could get him a job at the Postal Service, or he could go to Monterey and clerk for his half-brother, John B.R. Cooper. The first two opportunities did not come through, and that left only Monterey. It looks like going to the jumping-off place of the world to go to Monterey. As an aside, he wasn't in communication with his half-brother Cooper before he left. Cooper had extended the clerk opportunity to another relative who declined it. So at 29 years old, Larkin left Boston in 1831 and arrived 7 months later in Monterey by way of the Sandwich Islands and San Francisco. While in Oahu, Larkin made favorable impressions with the leading merchants and traders, all who were excellent contacts for his forthcoming business in Monterey. What did he find in Monterey? Well, let me fast forward through the history of Alta California. The native Indian populations, the establishment of the missions, the Russians, the fur otter trade, the English Hudson Bay Company, Mexican independence, the secularization of the missions, increased number of land grants, the establishment of huge ranchos, the hide and tallow trade, revolving Mexican governors, and in a few years, increasing overland immigration. The owners of the large ranchos continued the hide and tallow trade established by the missions. Hides, known as California banknotes, were almost the only form of exchange for the ranchos and sold between $1.10 and $3 each. The hides were shipped in the tens of thousands around Cape Horn to Boston shoe factories. Because coin was unavailable and hides too bulky to be used as currency, trade was based on barter, which could be complicated. For example, John Temple sent brandy from Los Angeles to Monterey and asked that Larkin deliver hides and tallow to Jose Aguilar, to whom Temple was in debt. A debt could be paid in cash or hides, but if it was stated in the contract, soap, wheat, or lumber might be accepted. It was frequently necessary to carry a debt for a long time while waiting for the next slaughter season. To recap, he goes to Monterey via Hawaii, meets his future wife on the ship, and arrives as a nearly penniless but experienced businessman, sociable, agreeable, and with a determination to acquire wealth. In 1832, he clerks for his half-brother. The next year, he marries Rachel Hobson Holmes. He manages his half-brother's ranch in Salinas. The Larkins move back to Monterey and live at William Hartnell's townhouse, where Larkin started a small store with goods sold on consignment. He engaged in debt collection for his half-brother and would, with persistence and persuasion, cajole people to pay their debts. Thus he was trading and establishing himself in the community. Between 1835 and 39, he builds the Larkin House with the money from his wife's former husband's estate that included a store on the ground floor. In 1835, he begins building an oven to make bread and ship's biscuits to sell to the whalers, hide traders, and U.S. Navy. He did well with that venture. In July, he bought lumber for his house, and eventually he would dominate the lumber industry for 15 years. His store became a center for coastal and foreign trade from Mazatlan in the south to New Helvetia in the north. He operated as a middleman, supplying the ranchos with cloth, clothing, china goods, liquor, molasses, sugar, rice, lumber, tools, furniture, and he obtained peas, corn, wheat, soap, dried beef, and most importantly, hides and tallow. In 1844 in Mazatlan, he engaged in trade with several firms and increased trade with Mexico more than anyone thought possible. In 1846, he purchased the entire cargo of a ship from Salem. No one had purchased on a scale like this before. He chartered vessels to carry goods to customers along the coast, and while he wasn't the most scrupulous of merchants, he would try to increase his profits at every opportunity. Neither was he the worst scoundrel. He communicated widely. In 1840, he was asked to write for a Hawaiian newspaper. He wrote to shippers and shipping newspapers where he listed the advantages of Monterey and his services. He wrote for the New York Sun and the New York Herald, promoting the abundance of California's resources and, this is important, encouraged the American occupation of California, following the Texas example. And he was a building contractor. In 1841, he was contracted to rebuild the custom house in Monterey. In 1845, to build a custom wharf. His reputation as a host for respectable visitors to Monterey was legendary, and he complained that his monthly food bill was half the profits of his retail trade, $3,000 a month in 1846. That's the equivalent of $112,000 per month today. He entertained people who would be of use to him, not employees, fur trappers, or escaped sailors. That said, in 1844, when the ship he returned on from Mazatlan brought smallpox, he opened his parlor to vaccinate the large number of people who couldn't afford to pay. The next day, 300 people of all classes were vaccinated, and hundreds more the following month. Between 1843 and 46, Larkin turned his retail operations over to employees through partnerships, and in April 46 he writes that he has turned his activities to loans, advances, and money transacting. He made loans in cash, which was the only type of credit you could charge interest on. Larkin's ability to establish and maintain good relationships with successive governors of the department allowed him to become their banker and their chief source of supplies. In short, he was simply the best connected person on the West Coast with good relationships among Americans, Californios, Mexican government officials, and the U.S. Navy. He earned his position as U.S. Consul, where he helped protect the interests and rights of American citizens in Alta California.